And I'm Erebus.
And this is Loving the Spectrum. If you're new to our channel, we put out videos once a week, generally on Fridays, sometimes on the weekends. We cover content based on our own experiences as queer, non-binary autistics. And we make this content for other autistics, LGBTQ+ folks, and simply anyone else that's here to learn.
This means that we're happy to interact with those who are here to learn, but we'll ultimately prioritize the voices of those in our communities.
If this sounds like the place for you, then subscribe for more of our content. We're even thinking about creating a podcast so that we can upload the same content in other formats that you can listen on the go. So hopefully we're going to look into that and hopefully get that up and running in the next couple weeks.
We've also created a link tree so that it's easier to stay connected across all of our channels. If you're able to contribute financially, you can donate to us directly to help support us in the continued creation of our content. Since we are both disabled and unemployed, it is difficult for us to support ourselves, and we're both currently relying on family. We both really want and need more financial independence, so if you can support us in any way, it would really mean a lot to us and it would be greatly appreciated.
Today's video will be about my experiences with a social justice special interest, how my views have changed as well as my goals, and what it's like to relate to social justice in this way. I'm really excited for this video because I've talked a lot about these topics, just like with friends and stuff, and kind of talking about just like how my views and values have changed over the years, but I've never really laid it out chronologically like this. So I'm really excited to kind of look back at some of the problematic stuff I did and really be able to just look at my growth in a more linear way, because I've definitely found that I have in the past been looking at myself as like, that was the bad version in the past, but now I'm good now. I've made all the changes that I need and now I'm like this blah blah blah, and like that's not true. So I'm really excited to kind of just see how my views have changed and what that has kind of looked like.
And yeah, with all that being said, let's get to the video.
Yeah, so before we can really get into more of like the specific topics, I want to talk a bit more about my social location to clarify like where I have been coming at all of this from, especially like from childhood. So I've grown up in a middle class / upper middle class family. Both my parents immigrated to Canada in their childhood, but both of their families going back have been like settlers / colonizers. More so on my mother's side of the family, they went back into the Caribbean and West Indies and were involved in the transatlantic slave trade and plantations, and like I knew about all of those things from a very young age, and that played a very large role in the ways that I got involved in certain things. So I think just for context, we didn't really learn about the impacts of what our family did. Even when I would ask and push and ask questions, it was very glossed over, very sugar-coated. Like, oh, they weren't the bad ones. Like, which is something that's literally not possible. You can't own a person and like be a good person. That's not possible. But pretty much just, it was very, very glossed over, and just a lot of my upbringing in terms of talking about race and things that I learned in school, especially like up until 6th grade, was very much like neoliberal, multiculturalism, like colorblind, melting pot stuff of just, yes, there are people of all different races in your class, but you don't see any of that. Like, everyone is the same. We're all one race, the human race. Everything was very glossed over, and beyond that, I also lived in a pretty conservative neighborhood. So that...
And like your school was around the same?
Yeah, like I went to a...
confronted with different views all that often?
Yeah, like I went to a private school up until the end of 6th grade, and then switched into Catholic school from 7th grade until the end of high school. So, especially once I went to a Catholic school, that changed a lot of stuff. But I'm going to get into how the social justice special interest really started, and that really kicked in for me around 8th grade, because I was switching out of my past special interest, which had been medicine and like surgeries and stuff, So I was switching out of that because I heard how much medical school costed, and that special interest died immediately. I'm not even kidding. But I was in school, and we were going through one of our textbooks for, I think it was like world history or something maybe, but we were talking about child labor that day, and they brought up Craig Kielburger and Free the Children, and I remember like learning about it and being like, oh my gosh, like this group of like kids got together and were like making all of these changes and stuff, and it felt very empowering to me as a kid, and I learned more about Midwee and Free the Children, which is now known as We Charity, and they had been very, very involved in like kind of like my upbringing into social justice. So once I literally learned about them in class and started learning more about like child labor and more like international issues instead of local stuff, I started learning more specifically through that one organization. So once I was in the summer between 8th grade and 9th grade, I went to their Midwee leadership camp for the first time, and honestly, I think a really big part of that was that it was a camp fully focused on my special interest, which I'd literally never been with other people that had the same interest as me, the same special interest as me before. And I have a very good feeling that there were a lot of neurodivergent people there because of the topic, and that was definitely the first time that I was ever with like-minded people, and it was like I could just tell that other people there wanted to change the world and make the world a better place, and it was very empowering for me at the time. And going into high school,
it was also like specifically just in how opposite of a reaction from the rest of like your school or your family or whatever you were getting,
because normally when I would talk about stuff, it would be like, oh, okay, Autumn, like we get it, like
it was
we
very
don't really
clear
want to
that
talk
people
about
were
it with
just
you.
kind of tolerating your interest, and they didn't share whatever passion you had in it, and this was your first time having that.
So like being able to meet other people my age and like other role models and mentors was like very, very impactful. And also, I was talking to Aravis about this yesterday, but it was the first time we ever talked about issues in a systemic way, because what Midwee did really well at the time, for me, like as a young person, learning about social justice was like talking about their pillars, so like talking about water and education and healthcare and alternative income, and how all of these things need to be like done together, like in unison, because you can't have education without access to water, and all these things are connected. And for me, that was like the first time I was really learning about issues in a systemic, connected way. And most people that I tried to talk to and be like, oh, these things are connected, they'd be like, no, they're not. And people would just brush me off. But this was the first time that I was being able to learn about things in a way that made sense for my neurodivergent brain. And like also just learning about things that are really important. So like we would be learning about like a lot of what we learned about was like capitalism, and talking about farming and agriculture, and how it was really interesting because like we would talk a lot about how like international agricultural groups would come in and plant harmful crops, and how those things would lead to a chain reaction that would be negatively impacting the people that live there. But we never talked about the negative impact of
you being there,
us coming into these countries and doing all of this work. So like we never talked about the systemic impact of that. So for me, like as like an 8th grader at this point, like I was like, whoa, like I'm learning all of these things. Like you're being told that like by learning about this stuff that you're like inherently changing the world, and especially being a young white person and feeling a lot of white guilt at this point, being like one of the only people in my family, at least in my mind, that was even taking our family history seriously. Like I felt a lot of internalized white guilt, and a lot of that really manifested in like a white savior complex, and it was just a lot of the social justice work that was running in high schools and elementary schools at that point was very internationally focused, at least the stuff that I was seeing most of the time, and that was very like white savory.
Yeah.
And especially being in Catholic schools and thinking about like mission trips, it makes sense that so much of the stuff was very outward. And then going into ninth grade too, that was also a big deal for me because this was the first time that, or I guess not the first time, because like I had been in like Catholic school for like 7th and 8th grade, but high school was really the first time I started learning more about abortion. And I hate to say this, but I was literally so pro-life at the time. In 9th grade, I like joined our pro-life club and like went to every weekly meeting and like didn't talk about it in class much, so like most people probably didn't know that I was pro-life. I don't remember how much I talked about it, but it was definitely a special interest. Like within social justice, like pro-life and abortion stuff was like a very specific focus of mine for the majority of high school. Like I would go home and I would watch like Ben Shapiro videos, which
You've come so far. It's okay. It's okay.
Like I only ever watched the ones talking about abortion, but I still don't, I don't know how I watched that and like
nodded along and like
it's so weird looking back because I can't, once my brain did the switch and like I became pro-choice, I no longer understand the way I used to think. So it's really interesting trying to look back now because I'm like, how the hell did I ever think that? Like,
but at the same time, it makes sense logically.
It makes sense because
from
like
everything around you, like
yeah, because like I was in Catholic schools at the time, and those like especially in like grade 12 we had like a philosophy class. Like I'm more like talking about 9th grade right now, but I was learning a lot about pro-life stuff specifically from a Catholic lens, despite not being religious myself. So a lot of the stuff that I would hear from them, I'd be like, okay, grain of salt, this is still coming from a religious lens because weirdly enough, I was not religious whatsoever. My main thing was like, I heard that a fetus or the unborn was a life. So once I heard that, and that was rooted in my mind as a fact, I could not let myself think about any other reason why someone would choose to terminate that pregnancy.
Yeah, and that's not an excuse for the way you were thinking. It's just like there was a fucking wall in your brain that you could not get past. And then once you did get past it, you couldn't go back.
Yeah.
But
and I'm also
so
curious how much of it has to do with me being autistic and like black and white thinking. Because that's very prominent for a lot of autistic people.
Yeah.
And for me specifically, it was really hard because like in my mind, I'm stuck at this like fetus equals life that needs protecting. So if anyone is trying to tell me reasons to kill this life, like they're trying to like distract from the issue, like by talking about like what, like in my mind at this point, talking about women's rights was a distraction, and like I thought that was really gross.
Yeah.
And like
because in your mind, the right of the fetus and the right of the woman carrying the fetus were two completely different discussions.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yeah. So this was like, this is how my mind was thinking at this point, and I was like very involved in our social justice club on campus at this point too. So this is the first time I was really able to get involved in like clubs where we can do more like weekly meetings and being able to like public speak and have like people see me as more of like a leader instead
people
of
listen to
people listen to me for the first time because like I knew about stuff. But yeah, and then again that summer for the second year in a row I went to the leadership camp again. And at this point, for me, I was viewed very positively for my involvement in social justice stuff. I never really had any negative reactions to me talking about stuff. Like, people would be like, oh, you're annoying, we don't care, but it was still like, oh, it's annoying that you're being a good person all the time. It was like that kind of thing.
You were never confronted with actual like contradicting opinions. People being like, hey, you being pro-life is shitty.
And like I remember having like one person, I remember having a couple interactions. Like I remember going up to one of my friends and being like, hey, do you want to join the pro-life club with me? It's like meetings are this stable. I started like going into this spiel about being like when the club meetings are, and she was like, oh fuck no, I'm pro-choice. And I was like, what? Because I just like went into this fucking spiel at her fucking locker, and she was like, oh no, like I don't know, it's a fucking clump of cells, and like walked away. And I was just like,
whoa.
And then went on with my day and like didn't think about it again. And it was just like, oh, okay, well I know I'm not going to talk about abortion stuff with this person, but like I didn't judge her for it or really care, but I was like, it was still, I was like, okay. But no one really pushed me much on my opinions, and the only times I was pushed by people were in very ableist ways, and that's what really cemented me being pro-life, because at the time, like a lot of the reasonings that people were giving for being pro-choice were like, oh, what if you found out that they were disabled? What would you do then? And I'd be like, well, dude, what the fuck? Is that supposed to be your, like...
Trump card or whatever?
Yeah, like, it made me feel really weird. And, like, I remember that being literally one of the main things that people would, like, try and argue me with, because they knew the, like... the reproductive justice part of like the person carrying it wasn't gonna faze me. So they're like, oh, okay, so like what about disability?
Yeah.
And like, I bet you'd want to get rid of them if they were disabled. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
No. So that just cemented me being pro-life even more.
Yeah. Which is unfortunate, because there are so many good arguments for being pro-choice that don't involve like eugenics.
And then by grade 10, I was still in the pro-life club again. This was the second year it was running, and I was an exec for the social justice club at this point, so I was able to like run meetings and stuff sometimes, which was really cool. My goal literally at this point was to literally work at We Charity someday. Like that was literally my life's goal, was to be like a facilitator for their workshops, and to like, like that was the goal. So, like, I was doing all of their things. Like, I was going to every wee day. I was volunteering with all of their stuff. I talked about it literally nonstop to anyone that would actually listen to me. And I even ended up getting chosen from my school to, like, go to Camp Olympia for, like, a free Catholic leadership camp week. So I got to go to a free, like, summer camp for a week and learn about, like, social justice stuff. It was, like, through a Catholic lens again, which was always really interesting for me, because like I was never religious, but being in a Catholic school, it was still like the norm. But yeah, like that was cool. But it was just like another example of like this specific kind of social justice being talked about. Like a lot of the stuff that we did at this camp was like very internationally focused. There wasn't really any conversation about like racism or homophobia or transphobia or classism. Like we did some stuff on like homelessness and talking about like very basic like symptomatic stuff, and like helping with sleeping bags and other more like downstream approaches. But it was really very much in like the last stages of helping someone once they are homeless.
Yeah.
But
like
not
basic survival needs.
Yeah, like survival needs. It wasn't really dealing with the root causes of like classism.
Mm-hmm. Or focusing on housing.
Or housing, or like any of the real root causes of what's happening. So it was all very like...
just like superficial.
Yeah, it was all very superficial, surface level social justice work. Mm-hmm. And then by grade 11, the pro-life club had shut down. But actually, by this point, I had gone to the March for Life 2 times, and that was like the big protest at Parliament, I believe, and it's literally one of the biggest pro-life rallies, and it's like really, really gross. But I remember being at these like dinners they would have the night before the rally, and I remember being at one the first time I went, and I'm pretty sure Abby Johnson was there. And she was like doing this speech on, she was just like talking about Planned Parenthood and how they like poked holes in all their condoms to make people have to get more abortions and how like condoms don't actually protect against STDs. Like, it was just so much misinformation, and yeah, it was just so bad. But yeah, by grade 11, the pro-life club had shut down because they didn't have a teacher to run it anymore. And I remember I was like the only person that really cared, so I kept trying to find a new teacher to run it, and then none of them wanted to, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll like take it upon myself to like bring pro-life stuff to Social Justice Club. So I went and did that, and I literally hate thinking about this stuff because I hate thinking about how many people I taught this stuff to that like might not have unlearned it since then, and it makes me very, very sad. But I was like, I would literally run Social Justice Club meetings on like pro-life stuff, and it was just very gross. But at this time, I was like, ooh, I'm saving the world. I literally thought I was doing the best thing ever. Yeah, and then throughout that year, I began fundraising to do my first Voluntourism trip. So, not exactly a mission trip because it wasn't religious based, but I went on a trip with We Charity to Ghana, and we built a school and
the whole thing.
The whole thing, the classic trip. It was like $5,000 to go. So I raised the money through like sending out emails to like friends, extended family, all this to like raise money. I also had a job at this point at a dance studio being like a teacher's assistant and like doing cleaning and stuff. But I didn't make a ton of money. Because I only worked a couple days a week, so it was mainly through like friends and extended family like donating me money, all like based on this like mass email I'd sent out with all this just like trauma porn stuff and just white saviorist like, oh, help send me over to like help, and it was just like very
typical Neil.
Very, very typical. So yeah, like that trip really just like cemented, for the beginning part anyway, really cemented a lot of the white saviorist notions that we had, because literally even when we got there, it was like the first day that we went to go and meet people, they had this like orchestrated like dance and stuff for us when we got there, and it was very much like the whole situation just felt very orchestrated and very performative in a way to like make us for our benefit, to make us feel good and taken care of, and like we were
despite the fact that the whole premise of this trip was you guys going over there to help, and yet everything was orchestrated to make you feel comfortable. That makes sense.
But another interesting thing that happened was, towards the end, I had a conversation that really changed how I viewed abortion, and I was not expecting this conversation to happen at all. It was like late one night after we had dinner, and we were all talking about something, and the topic of abortion came up, and I made some comment about like, oh, well, like obviously I'm pro-life, and everyone looked at me like, what the fuck? And I was immediately just like very defensive, like, what, you guys aren't? And they were all like, oh, blah, 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 and started going off, like, about how, like, awful pro-life stuff can be, and obviously, and I was just like, rejection sensitivity, and, like, ran back to my room, because I was, like, starting to go nonverbal a bit, which I think I'm realizing now as well, but, I, like, ran back to my room, mainly because I didn't know how to talk, and I didn't want to make people have to, like, explain stuff to me. But it was like
you didn't want to force emotional labor out of them.
Yeah, I was
by,
like, clearly
through
this
your
is
reaction because you knew you were reacting some type of way.
Yeah. I could tell my reactions were making people uncomfortable, so I'm like, I'm gonna remove myself from this situation. I don't know if any of you have had abortions or know someone else that has, so I'm just gonna remove myself. Obviously, I didn't tell anyone because I just ran away.
Yeah.
But that was what was going through my head at the time. But someone ended up following me back to my room and was like, hey, I can tell you're very upset right now, so like I'm not expecting to change your mind or anything, but I would like to share a personal story with you if that's okay. And I was like, yeah, that's okay. And she explained her experiences of dealing with an abortion herself, and that conversation immediately just started switching stuff in my brain, because like that was the first time I'd like met someone that I knew was like disclosing to me that they had experienced this, and like why they had experienced it and how that impacted them. And the shift didn't happen immediately, but as soon as I got back, I started to like unpack the pro-life stuff more, and I started to like push back against that like block in my brain telling me to like not
think about the situation
as a whole.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of like trying to push through that, and once I did, I was like, okay, yeah. By the time I got to university, I had pretty much solidified the fact that I was pro-choice, but that one conversation specifically was very, very impactful for me.
Yeah, it started kind of the domino effect into you unpacking everything.
Yeah. I actually messaged them like a few months ago during the pandemic being like, hey, this conversation meant a lot for me, and you provided a lot of emotional labor that I didn't reciprocate well enough at the time. Can I like send you an e-transfer for like dinner or something? Because like I just want to say that I really appreciate the labor that went into that conversation, because that was a little shit. And they're like, oh, like I really appreciate you reaching out, but like no worries, like blah blah blah. And we just like talked about it a little bit. But yeah, like for me that conversation was like very impactful, and I very much recognized the amount of emotional labor that goes into disclosing that kind of thing and having those kinds of conversations. That's something that I've always tried to be aware of and like not ask for emotional labor from people. Yeah. And then by grade 12, I was the president of our social justice club, so I was running even more meetings and then starting to branch out into more conversations about like sexism and talking about sexual harassment. I remember looking at this person this morning to make sure I got the name right, but I remember doing this one meeting talking about this YouTuber, Sam Pepper, that had that prank channel where he would just grope women on the streets.
Fucking hate
and I remember doing this one like meeting where we talked about it, and I literally just went off the entire meeting being like, sexual harassment's not fucking okay. And we just like spent the whole thing talking about like sexual harassment and stuff, and like
framing it as a joke doesn't make it okay.
Yeah, so like between conversations like that that were, at least for me, starting to get more impactful, I was still participating in other Midwee like based
just like
performative activism stuff, like the Vow of Silence. I'm not sure if anyone remembers that or if it's still going on, but it would be like a day where you wouldn't talk all day. Sometimes you would have like a piece of tape over your mouth, and it was supposed to represent the voiceless, and like having a day to be voiceless, to symbolize
it's supposed to make you learn something.
It's supposed to make you learn something, but in reality all it does is it makes people think that there are voiceless people, and that's not true. No one is voiceless. Like
they're being silenced.
And this is like a very active silencing, and I think talking about people as being voiceless really aids in like the white savioristic notion of like speaking on behalf of other marginalized groups.
Yeah, as opposed to just giving them the mic in the first place.
Exactly. Like instead of spending that day like highlighting what marginalized communities are actually saying and experiencing, it's like, oh, I as a white person am just not gonna talk all day and like carry around a picture of like a person or a list of things that are important to me
instead
or something.
Of like paying a bunch of speakers to come in and actually teach you some real shit. Like
and like these were all things that like at the time I thought was so impactful. I thought that like me taking the day to like not speak was like peak peak activism. Like, yeah, because, like, a lot of these little things are really treated as being like that, because I'm like, especially for white kids, like, doing what looks to other white people as bare minimum is, like, applauded so much. And yeah, it was just very obvious to me, especially, like, in the beginning of my journey with social justice stuff, especially when I was, like, pro-life and, like, being all, like, white saviory. I got a lot of applause from white people. Got, like, the equity award for my school board. I was able to use that stuff on, like, college applications.
Your mom was super proud of you.
Like, my mom was so proud of my activism stuff, like, would always be posting about it on Facebook and, like, using it as a way to, like, brag about stuff. And that was honestly one of the big parts that started making me realize how problematic it was. Because once I was seeing how other people were, like, once I started actually looking at the ways that other people were reacting to what I was doing, it made me more uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, I remember this one day getting back from school and my mom telling me that we had someone come in to, like, fix something in our basement. And
this story.
They happened to be from Ghana. Like, my mom learned this in conversation with them. And my mom was like, oh, wow, my daughter did this mission trip there and built a school and blah, blah, blah. Oh, come upstairs so I can show you the photos. And, like, brought him up to my room to look at these photos of me, like, volunteering on this trip. And I like, feel so uncomfortable that that's a thing that happened. And
and that feeling of discomfort
what made
you stop and think.
What made me be like, why am I so uncomfortable with this? And then I'm like, oh,
because it's fucked up.
Because I wasn't doing this stuff to make a difference. Like there was just so much performative stuff in it that I didn't realize at the time, or that I wasn't letting myself accept. And seeing other people praise it and, like, seeing that reflected back, I was like, oh wait, this feels off. And once I realized why, it became very clear. But yeah, so, like, at that point, the social justice stuff was still viewed, like, very well from, like, outsiders. And it's been interesting for me to think about this and, like, sad at the same time. But, like, I did not have very many friends growing up. I would maybe have, like, one friend at a time. Like, at most, I would have, like, 3 or 4 friends at most. And that would be, like, I would have, like, one specific friend and then be friends with, like, the other people in their group, maybe. Or, like, maybe they would tolerate me. But, like, it's always been very, very hard for me to make friends. And I remember literally getting the biggest heart award at prom and being like, okay, so clearly everyone thinks I'm a good person, but also no one wants to be friends with me. Like, no one wants to talk to me. No one wants to be friends with me. No one wants to include me in things. So clearly it was like, people recognized that I was, like,
nice and, like, kind.
Nice and trying to be a good person, but was I the kind of person that made people feel safe or comfortable to be around? Not necessarily. There are a lot of other things wrapped up in why I didn't have friends, but, like,
from your perspective.
From my perspective, like,
at that time, that's what it felt like.
Yeah. And then, so, now going to university is when stuff really started switching for me, and when a lot more of my growth started happening, because I was able to, like, move out of my home, move away from, just, like, the people and communities and everything that I've been used to, and go into a new space, into a new environment where I can kind of start off fresh and learn again. So going into university, I originally started off doing 3 different majors because I was very adventurous, but I originally started off doing speech communication, peace and conflict studies, and psychology. And I was living in one of the religious colleges on campus. It was very conservative. And I was, like, recently out. I'd come out in high school as bi, and then when I ended up getting to university, I actually had to pretty much go back into the closet because I was living at this conservative residence. but I was like out
And
to
you
like
didn't-
friends in my classes and stuff.
You
But
didn't initially realize that it was
Yeah.
as conservative as it was, because like they mostly picked it because it was the dorm with the best food,
yeah,
which is really fair because like, yeah, the food caliber is off the charts compared to
Yeah.
every other dorm on campus. But anyway,
yeah, it definitely sucked because like I didn't realize how conservative it was gonna be going
Yeah.
in, but
at least the food was good.
yeah, the food was good. But yeah, so once I was in university, I started getting involved in like the services that we had on campus. So I didn't really get involved enough in first year. I went to like a couple events with our Glow Center on campus, which is like our LGBT center, and our Women's Center. So I like went to some events at both of those. I remember going to like the Women's Center ones, and at this point, like identifying as pro-choice, but still having a lot of that stuff that I still had to unlearn, and like
Yeah.
going to volunteer training and being like, okay, cool, and being like very proud of myself for like volunteering to be part of an organization that was like aggressively pro-choice. And I was like, I know that I'm still having some stuff to work through, but like I'm happy knowing that whatever situation I'm in, I will
Be pushed to be better.
be like as pro-choice as possible in like whatever I'm doing. And it was just like, it was a very obvious decision to be a part of an organization that was openly pro-choice. So like being a part of that, I was like, okay, I am pro-choice now. I can leave that stuff behind. I am now
It's
pro-choice.
cemented,
It is cemented as like a specific change. I'm no longer bad pro-life autumn person. That part is behind. And it like, I feel like those specific changes and like labeling specifically made my view of my growth less linear. Like it's made it harder to do that
Yeah, it's
because I
kinda
would like
chopped it up.
chop up who I used to be.
Yeah.
Like based on like labels and stuff that I've been using at the time. But I learned a lot in my first year at university. Like one of the classes that I learned a lot from was Intercultural Communication. We like had a really amazing prof, and I remember learning about just like the ways that you use language to talk about oppression and like actually labeling the oppressors when you're talking about something. So instead of talking about violence against women, it's like who's doing that violence. It's misogynistic violence. Like it is like, what exactly are you trying to name and how do you name it? So I was like able to take a lot more classes that were like focused on social justice stuff, which was really cool, and go to like on-campus events with like profs and other students, and just it was really cool to be able to learn in different ways because university is very different from like high school and elementary school. With a lot of my classes, they were also small class sizes, so I was still in classes that were under 30 people, especially for my speech communication ones. So those are really, really interesting, and I learned a lot like very quickly, and I found like especially going into first year, I learned a lot about racism that I did not know before.
Yeah.
And so much of the stuff that I'd been learning before then was very like colorblind focused, and everything we were doing in my speech communication classes was literally naming things specifically and being like, no, you can't be colorblind. You need to name the oppressions that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You can't ignore the systemic nature of issues to make yourself feel better. And it was very much calling out things directly, and it was just very impactful.
And it forced you really to just unlearn all that shit like pretty immediately, because you can't really I mean, it's harder to learn new things that contradict your old base of knowledge if you don't first unlearn that base of knowledge.
Yeah. And then also like in terms of speech communication, another thing that we did was also just like talk about just like privilege and speaking in class and stuff. And that wasn't something I'd really thought of too much before, because we always had like participation marks. So it'd be like, you're supposed to speak to get participation marks.
Yeah.
And I'm generally someone that if we're talking about something that I'm interested in class, I will be raising my hand until the teacher tells me to stop. So especially being in like social justice focused classes, I had a prof come up to me in first year, and I can't remember what the conversation was that we were talking about, but was pretty much like, hey, just remember that like you don't want to take up too much space in this conversation so that other students like have a space to speak. But like it was more focus, like, specifically on my social location, and, like, it wasn't just, oh, make sure that other people have time to speak. It was literally, like...
Be sure you're not taking opportunities away from people in different social locations. Like,
Yeah, it was, like, it was just communicating that in a way that clicked for me more, because as a white person, it took more to click, and that prof just made a lot of stuff click for me very well. And yeah, another thing that definitely just started changing things a lot more for me was just having my own experiences with sexual violence and homophobia, and, like, seeing transphobia and racism and, like, the experiences that my friends were dealing with and, like, were telling me about. And I hadn't had many queer or trans or racialized friends before getting to university. So once I was in university and I had more of these friends and we were, like, talking about stuff in person, I was like, oh, like, I did not realize that all of these things were happening, like, as frequently as they were. And, like, it literally took until first year for me to realize a lot of this stuff. Like, even after framing myself, like, as this
social justice
person, yeah. But, like, definitely dealing with my own experiences of, like, sexual violence, specifically, like, in bars and stuff in university, made things very real. And at this point, I was also working more. So, like, in the summers between school, I would be working all summer at a different nonprofit. The first summer, between first and second year, I worked as a receptionist in, like, a family services type clinic, where you would have, like, therapy and stuff. And I've had a lot of conversations with one of my friends that also worked there at a different location. But knowing that they were housing programs for marginalized groups and hearing the really racist conversations they would have in between sessions and, like, talking about clients, and it was just really, really gross, and I could not wait for my job to be done there. So yeah, like, the people at the workplace were definitely pretty racist.
Yeah.
And yeah, like, what were you saying earlier?
I was saying that, like, you didn't call out the racism, like, because of the situation you were in, and you probably should have, but you didn't.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the frustration from that channeled into your newfound obsession with getting into Facebook arguments.
Yeah.
That's something that I had a long period of struggling with too, is just, like, getting into Facebook arguments in the comment sections of whatever shitty ableist posts, and not really knowing where to draw the line at which, like, this person isn't taking in my emotional labor or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, and, like, I definitely felt very trapped, like, especially when I would be, like, this would definitely have been, like, when I would have been staying back at home with my family and, like, working in these jobs surrounded by, like...
And then you couldn't complain about the racist shit they were saying in the workplace, because the response at home wouldn't be taken seriously either.
Exactly. So I definitely got a lot more into the online social media stuff, which makes a lot more sense, like, when you put it that way. So I spent a lot of time in Facebook arguments. Like, I remember regularly getting into, like, comment fights that were just, like, 100 comments down, when people literally had no intention of trying to understand me and were just trying to just keep pushing it. But I would just spend all this time on these arguments talking about, like, transphobia or racism or colonialism or ableism, like, all these things. And it was just so exhausting, and I didn't realize when to stop trying with people. Because
I think one of the big factors there too is just straight up, like, being autistic, not being able to take in social cues, especially from internet correspondence where tone is completely missing, and, like, shit can be miscommunicated so easily, and, like, it sometimes you literally can't tell when someone is straight up trolling you.
Yeah.
And is only planning on wasting your time for the next 100 comments or whatever, as opposed to someone who's actually trying to, like, share their opinion or, like, have some kind of discussion that ends in that actually has an end goal aside from, I'm going to waste this person's time.
Yeah, so like at this point, my social justice was more focused on like reproductive rights and talking about anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, and I don't think I was at capitalism yet, but I was very much like in that specific area of like starting to get into anti-racism stuff, like still very entry level knowledge, but
you were starting
like
to
I was
realize
starting
the
those
importance of
conversations
it.
with family and like calling family members out more. And yeah, definitely my first year, that's when at least my mom's view of my social justice stuff changed from being like, oh, this is so great, I can post about this, I can brag about this, to oh,
I don't like this
I don't like
anymore.
this anymore. Why are you telling me to stop doing things?
Yeah.
I don't like that.
When they were at the white savior level, it was
Yeah.
all very acceptable. But as soon as it was, I don't know, anything actually meaningful.
Yeah. Yes, like at that point, my social justice stuff was very much viewed as like interfering with my studies. But when I got an award, or if I could use it for a job or something, then that was fine. Like that was great. Then I could brag about that. But I still shouldn't really talk about it too much because it's like inconveniencing people and I'm being too negative. Like that was a lot of the feedback that I was getting, at least from like my mom. But in terms of other people, like
and it was like specifically people are annoyed.
Yeah.
With how much you talk about this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Like people don't like hearing about all of this. You're being so divisive.
You're making people not want to spend time with you.
Yeah.
Or listen to you. That was another big one.
Yeah, that was very frustrating. And then by second year, that was when I was more regularly volunteering with Glow in the Women's Center. And then even that summer, I started working for a nonprofit downtown Toronto focusing on LGBTQ plus rights. And like that first year there was great. I was working in the fundraising department. That was very interesting. It was really nice being surrounded by other queer people in the workplace. Like that was one of the best parts of the job, was like having like picnics and stuff and having like game days and just like having queer people that I worked with and having just like mentors that I could look up to. But when I would talk to my coworkers, I very quickly learned how fucked up nonprofits are. Like so many nonprofits are like awful to their workers. Like being a summer student, you can see like some of that, but like
you're not there long enough.
There long enough to see everything fully. So by the time I went back the next year, the summer after third year, like most of the racialized people I worked with had quit or been fired, or I'm pretty sure mainly resigned, but like it was just really fucked up. Like I remember getting back and being like, whoa, what happened? Like where is everyone? And they're like, yeah, like
the whole vibe of
the whole vibe was completely different. They'd like gotten someone to like oversee more stuff, and it just, the whole vibe was very different and was way more capitalistic focused, and it just, the focus was more on donors and respectability than the actual lives and
you were supposed to be advocating for.
Yeah, exactly. It was really gross and disappointing. So I went back there for that second summer. But yeah, that was really sad. And then yeah, in my third year I was an exec for Glow at this point, so I had a couple different exec positions, and then I became a coordinator, which was like the head, so like running the service on campus. And I was like very involved at this point. One of my big things was like reaching out to other clubs and services and trying to like collaborate, especially with different racial groups on campus, like trying to make sure that our service was more intersectional and like a more accessible place for people. Yeah. And just like actively thinking about the different kinds of oppression that people face and how you can't just have a day talking about race. Like you need to like actively ingrain it in the things that we're doing.
Yeah, otherwise it defeats the purpose of intersectionality.
Yeah. So I was like doing a lot of learning in the work that I was doing on campus. So I was also like working with staff and faculty in like a equity-based LGBTQ plus workshop, so trying to teach staff and faculty about how to be more inclusive to queer and trans students on campus. So I was doing a lot of work behind the scenes and within the institution, and that was like so draining. And at this point I was meeting and befriending a lot more other activists on campus, so we were like, that was really like one of the first times that I made like a really, really solid friend group of like people that also share like my special interest and of like wanting the same changes that I'm looking for.
Yeah. And caring about what you have to say.
Yeah, and it's been so amazing to just like learn from so many people. And like, I asked on my Instagram earlier if anyone had questions, and one of the ones that people had was just like saying that I had a lot of great like knowledge and resources that I've been sharing, and like what are some of the people or groups that I've been like looking up to. And I don't even know how to start with the amount of people that have like taught me stuff, because like
it's been so many people. Like I try to like, from like actual profs to just peers.
Yeah, to literally just peers like making a comment in class, or like just actively following more people on social media. Like there's so many different places to be getting more information. Yeah, like I've just learned from so many people, from like profs to other students in my classes to like other YouTubers or people on TikTok or Twitter. Mm-hmm. Like honestly, whenever I see a big hashtag like actually autistic, I will go and like follow a bunch of autistic creators, or like just, I honestly just try and follow as many like Black, trans, disabled, like queer, like as many different people as I can to learn as many different viewpoints as I can. I don't know, like anytime you hear about different issues that you're interested in, like follow people that are actually living those things.
Yeah, because
so,
there
like,
are always going to be people on social media talking about it. You just have to put in the effort to find it.
And like, yes, following specific organizations are good, but like following real people that can just share like their daily lived experiences is also very impactful. I can definitely make a list of some people in the description to see if you can follow some below. But my memory's been really bad recently, so it's been really hard for me to like actually think of like a list
specific
of stuff.
Resources.
But like specifically over the last couple of years, like I've learned so much from Black women and Black femmes and Black trans people in my life, like from like profs to like some of my best friends. Like I don't know how
to
like,
articulate
how much they've contributed to like the person I am now, and just like how much I've been able to learn from them. Yeah, like I learned so much from my friends. I think I have very good taste in friends. So the people I have in my life now, like I learned so much from them every day. Like I'm so inspired by the people I have in my life and like the things that they've been a part of. Like being in being in the city I am in, Ontario, we have a lot of really strong activists, especially a lot of really strong student leaders in our community, and it's been like really, really cool to be able to just like be a part of this community. And yeah, sorry, my mind has been like all over the place, so this is still gonna be very disconnected. I can't remember what my last thought was, but
okay, I think you should start this by going into like, by the time you got into fourth year you started thinking much more about like the systemic shit that was happening at your own university and like within your student union, and that's what motivated you to run and then do it. Yeah, so by fourth year I had been involved in like my stuff in my classes, because all of my studies were very social justice oriented at this point. I'd switched into my final like double major, which was speech communication and gender and social justice. So I'd been cemented in that. I'd been working within the Glow Center and doing that stuff on campus and working with our
like other student-run services on campus and trying to like help like bridge some communication gaps between different groups. So by the time I was in 4th year, we'd been learning a lot about theory, but I'd also been having a lot of my own like real life experiences. In 2nd year, I'd had more experience of sexual harassment, but by 4th year, I had been assaulted multiple times. I even had one instance that went as far as me almost being trafficked, and I had to go to the police pretty much for support after. And I will probably make a video about this in the future, but I was not supported in any way, and that definitely radicalized me even more. Like, I already did not like or support the police. I was already for abolishing the police, like, but like seeing it and like it was just
so blatant.
It was just so blatant. Like it just like
having your
it was just so gross. And for me, this was also like at like in the peak of the Toronto police criticism with like how they'd handled the other queer people that had been going missing and literally being killed. So their response was absolutely messed up. But I will probably make a video about that in the future if people are interested. But so I'd had a lot of my own real life experiences with like oppression and violence and discrimination and like dealing with homophobia like on campus and in like my own relationships with like family and stuff. I was dealing with a lot of real life things that I hadn't when I first started being involved in social justice stuff. Like when I first started learning about things, it was very much like me as someone that is completely separated from issues can go and help this other by like donating money or building a school or doing this or that or like raising awareness. But now at this point it was like I'm being assaulted, I'm being raped, I'm dealing with homophobia, I'm dealing with transphobia, like I'm dealing with all these things, I need support. Like I'm not just supporting other people, I'm also saying like I'm at the point that I need this support for myself as well. Like I need systemic changes for myself. And like as a white person, it shouldn't have taken me having any experiences of my own to get involved. Yeah, so I think like for me, I had a lot of privilege very early on, and when you look at social location and you break up your identity into like race, gender, class, sexuality, all of these things, we can't forget that like whiteness is the most powerful tool that is like the most powerful aspect of that.
Not all privilege is at the same level.
Yeah. And the way that whiteness affects your oppression in other groups
is the most impactful.
Yeah.
Because the foundation of our society is currently white supremacy, whiteness is the thing that is the most beneficial when it comes to intersectionalities.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was talking about that a lot more with like family and like friends and coworkers and things like that, and at this point I was getting a lot more pushback because instead of just being like a passive person that like identifies as an ally and just doesn't actually do anything, I was actively pressing back and being like, no, this thing that you are doing right now is racist. This thing you are doing right now is problematic. You need to stop. Like I wasn't giving people the benefit of the doubt anymore. And I had been doing that for a long time, like a lot in part because I had like I just valued my comfort more.
Rejection sensitivity also had a big part, I think.
Yeah, but also being like a white person, like rejection sensitivity is going to be different than like other people. Like,
I
can still like
and, like as a white person who, especially early on, you weren't out as anything. Like you had the easy option of staying quiet and avoiding any conflict. Yeah. And I think the more intersecting identities you realized about yourself, like your sexuality and your gender, the less of an option it was to stay quiet.
Yeah, and that also just shows how much privilege there is in whiteness, because there were times that, like, my disability or, like, my queerness or my transness weren't apparent to other people, but people could always see my whiteness and always give me the power and privileges that came with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, before I came out as being queer, I've always been white, and I will continue to be white even as I'm a queer person, even as I'm a trans person, even as I'm disabled. I'm still white, and that will still give me the benefits and privileges within all of those groups.
Yeah, and even in experiencing oppression for whatever else you got going on, you're still experiencing the privilege from your whiteness.
Yeah. Like, talking about white privilege, that was very evident to me when I got more involved in our student association. So when I was in 4th year, I had originally been planning on, like, finishing off 4th year, finishing off my classes, graduating, moving on. But I ended up deciding to run for our student association and ended up getting involved with a friend of mine, and then we combined with another slate to create our slate, and we had a very, like, equity focused campaign and platform, and it was like myself as the one white person on the team, and 3 racialized people, and our campaign was very focused on, like, rejecting white supremacy and ableism and transphobia and changing campus for the better and, like, actively changing the ways that systems worked.
Mm-hmm.
And in the ways that people reacted to our campaign and voted, they ended up electing me along with the 3 white candidates from the other slate. Mm-hmm. So our campaign stuff was very, very confusing, but there was a lot of racist stuff that went into the campaign, which I can't get into all the details of because it's a very, very long, convoluted story. But, like, doing that specific campaign, like, showed me so much about, like,
the campaign that specifically culminated in the, like, cherry-picked kind of election of the only white people that were applying for each position.
Mm-hmm.
There was a great article in our school newspaper. Right after the election.
Yeah, so pretty much it was myself that was elected from my team, and then I replaced the one racialized person on the other slate. So they pretty much elected all of the white people across 3 separate slates. So last year, I worked at the student association as part of this team, and it was exhausting. Like, being a part of the system, like, inside of the system, when you're expected to work within those, like, pathways
and protocols,
and without having other people around you that are fighting for those same things, mm-hmm. It can be, like, very, very, very difficult. And for me, when I got into this position, they also told me, like, you're not allowed to talk about social justice stuff while you're here. Like, don't talk about human rights stuff. Specifically, we don't want you talking about Palestine. We don't want
politics.
We don't want you to talk about politics because it's
because, as we all know, identities are political. Like, queerness is inherently political, so you can't talk about that shit, even though you are queer.
So they were, like, trying to control what I did on my own personal social media, which was ridiculously difficult for me because, for one, like, I am talking about things that have to do with my life. Like, I'm talking about bills that are being passed that are going to affect my life, my partner's life, my friends' lives. Like, it just was so frustrating to me that politics was seen as this just topic that I just shouldn't talk about.
As if it's not your life.
And there was just so much going on with that, and it was just exhausting for me to also, like, have my position was also very focused on all of the equity aspects within the organization, so, like, overseeing the different student-run services, but I just felt like there was no way for me to just do my job properly because it was just so...
Because they weren't letting you do your activism either. And, like, how are you supposed to advocate for marginalized students if you're not allowed to advocate at all? Like, that was such a...
Like, it was really, really disheartening to have spent like months leading up to that, like campaigning on like accessible bathrooms and like just so many different equity-based initiatives and like anti-racism initiatives, and to get in and not be able to do any of that stuff. Like at the end of my term, right before COVID hit, we started doing this research on the experiences of queer and trans students within health services, and I literally don't even know where that is now that I'm gone, like, because like COVID hit and everything happened, and it just...
Yeah, and like even with that survey, like a large part of that was literally queer and trans people you knew in your daily life reaching out to you, like us talking about my appointments. And like it, so for the other people you were working with, I don't think it clicked for them a lot of the time that the shit you were working on didn't just stay at work. Because like you're working all day reading through surveys from other trans people talking about the trauma they faced at health services. And then you come home to me and, you know, I have to complain about my shit too. Sorry about that.
No. But yeah, like, that pretty much gets to the end of, like, the chronological bit. But just getting into, like, what that has all, like, meant for me, like, also just, like, having a social justice special interest is so exhausting because, like, as I just ran you through, like, grade 8 to graduating university of, like, my life, almost everything I did or was involved with was social justice focused, and all that stuff is very heavy and very draining. So whether or not I was like personally impacted by the thing, so if we were talking about like sexual violence or homophobia or sexism, like that stuff is very exhausting for me. And even reading stuff that I'm not affected by is also very draining, and like it's
emotionally draining.
It's very emotionally draining, and it's very hard to find ways to relax. And this is something I've thought about a lot because, especially now knowing that I'm autistic and like why I relate to stuff in this way and like why I'm able to spend so much time talking about social justice stuff, but I also recognize like how much of my life was spent literally looking at it as just something I was interested in instead of something I was affected by. And how like when that switch became more evident to me that like, oh, I'm now actually being affected by these things, that's when I started getting more radical. And like, I wish it didn't take me being impacted by things to like actually take the time to learn more. Yeah, so I think I want to just get into a bit more of a summary. I can't remember if I mentioned that already. My brain has been very loopy today. But yeah, so for me, like, accountability and, like, responsibility have been very, very important. And, like, this video has been very interesting to record, and I've been pausing and stopping a lot because it's been really hard for me to, like, think through stuff. But I think it's really important to talk about where we've gone wrong in the past and, like, admit when we've been wrong. And like actually take responsibility for the things that we've done, because
and for
like
the impact that those things
and for the
had.
impacts that those things have had. Like, I think about those old like social justice meetings that I ran so often, like the ones where I talked about like pro-life stuff, and where I like would show all of my like photos from like the trip I was on and talk about how inspiring people, like it just, like, looking back at that stuff makes me really sad. And like it's not like I'm like, oh, I'm embarrassed, it's embarrassing to talk about. I'm like, no, that's not the thing. It makes me sad knowing that like I taught people that stuff. It makes like it and it just it sucks knowing that there are things that you do that you can't take back, but what you can do is like try to learn and grow and get better. So like that's why I'm trying to like do this channel now and try and share new updated information.
He wants to go.
Yeah. Okay.
Come pass me over me. Do you need a change in location? No, he's fine.
What was this thing? But yeah, so like that's why we wanted to like make this channel, to be able to talk about kind of like the stuff that we know now. Like, what would I have changed differently? So like, this will definitely be a series that I revisit. I'm sure this video was convoluted in a lot of ways. Long. I appreciate it for anyone that actually stuck around this long. I hope I explained things somewhat well. The lights are very bright and have been throwing me off, so I need to figure out better ways to think properly with the lights on while we're filming, because generally it's pretty hard. But yeah, like, please ask like questions down below, because I'd be curious to know like if stuff has or hasn't made sense to you from this video. Yeah, and I also just want to make it very clear that like I don't want like reassurance from people like telling me that like stuff I did was okay. Like, that's not what this is. But yeah, thanks to everyone that has stuck around and watched this whole video, because I know it's definitely been a long one. So next week's video, we will be talking about our experiences with autistic and ADHD traits in childhood. So tune in next week to hear about how our disabilities affected us at home, in the classroom, and with friends. So comment below any questions you have for next week. And as always, like, subscribe, and check out our link tree in the description to stay updated.
See you next time.
Bye!